Hi everybody, today we're going to make the 6-inch block organizer roll. This is the palm leaf block from the Perfectly Pieced December 2025 subscription box from Me Time Delivered, which is a Kimberbell company. This is the last box that actually offered a box where you could get it with the fabric and everything. They're switching to digital January of next year, but don't worry, I'm going to be continuing to do tutorials on these. I have a fun project planned for next year for Perfectly Pieced, and as we work through the blocks each month, we'll talk about fabric selection, color, how to come up with a nice fabric bundle that's going to look good for your project that month. Let's go over what you're going to need today. You're going to need some light mesh cutaway stabilizer. I used fusible backing for the borders, paper tape, and I've got the fabric that came with the box for this one, so everything is cut according to the 6-inch block instructions. We're going to be making 4 blocks. I have everything labeled. I've also cut my border fabric. I've cut this a little bit differently. When we get to the borders, I'll explain why. And the other piece of fabric we need, I believe this is going to be the inside of the design roll. I'll be using the Glide Mercury thread that came in the box, and there's also a little ribbon. I'm going to be using a 9.5 by 14-inch hoop today. I'm going to work on 2 blocks at a time. We need a total of 4 for this project. I'll make 2 on camera and 2 off camera. I've got my light mesh cutaway loaded, hand tighten, screwdriver tighten. Let's head over to the machine. On my machine right now, I have one of these Schmetz Super Non-Stick needles. It's an 8012 needle. Since it's on the machine, I'm going to go ahead and keep using it. A regular 7511 embroidery needle would work absolutely fine for this project. And I'm going to do the entire project using this Glide Mercury thread that came in the box. I'm on a Baby Lock Meridian. My files are on USB. We need to start with the 6-inch palm leaf block. I can fit 2 into my hoop. Let's go ahead and bring up 1. Hit set. I'm going to move it to the top, and then we're going to duplicate it. We're going to hit edit, and you have 2 ways to duplicate your block. If you're on a Baby Lock or a Brother, your buttons will probably look exactly the same. A regular duplicate key and a border duplicate key. The regular duplicate key will have you complete 1 and then the next one. The border duplicate key will have you do the same thing on both blocks at the same time. That's the one that I like to use. The up and down is already grayed out, so we want to add 1 below. Hit the plus. You've got 2 blocks. You want to space them out. Give yourself as much room as you can. This is ready to go. I'm going to hit OK. Save it to your machine in case something happens. And remember, you have to have 4 blocks, so I can work through 2 and then work through 2. We're ready to go. I'm going to hit embroidery. I have the Mercury thread on my machine. My machine is going to do everything twice because I used that border duplicate key. The first thing that's going to stitch out is the batting placement line, and you stitch that out right on your stabilizer. You want to place your batting and cover those placement lines. This is a 6-inch finished block, so I cut my batting at 7 inches square. If you're not sure what size to cut your batting, add an inch to the finished block size. You want to make sure that you completely cover that placement line. You can add a piece of tape to help hold it down. Double check. And I'm going to tape my other one, and then we're going to stitch the batting tack down. Once these are tacked down, you need to trim away the extra batting that is outside of that tack down line. That's all trimmed. If you ever accidentally trim your stabilizer, put a piece of paper tape on the bottom. Make sure it's pressed on nice and good, and keep going. You'll be fine. The next thing we're going to stitch out is called the piecing template. It's going to stitch out the outline of the palm leaf, and that's going to help us place our fabrics to make the block. You want to grab your piece 1 fabric, which for this project, if you're using the kit, is the white sparkly fabric. In the printed instructions, it shows a different color fabric on the block by block instructions. So make sure to be careful with your fabric placement. You want to follow the fabrics that you cut and prepped for the design roll project. If you just heard a loud squeak or squawk, whatever you want to call it, that's one of our rescue birds. That was Rainbow, the Rosella parrot. I'm going to place a piece right side up for each of them. Whenever you're off the bed of your machine, support underneath with your hand. I'm double checking. You want to make sure you've completely covered that square. Then we're going to stitch a trimming and placement line. Now it said in the instructions to center this piece of fabric over the square here, which I did. I just barely caught that trimming placement line. Do you see that? That's really interesting. Maybe I have my fabric a little more over that way. Doesn't matter, as long as it caught. Now, if you had yours more over that direction and you've got an extra piece of fabric here, you would trim that off. Mine stitched right along the edge. I've got nothing to trim. You want to grab your piece 2 fabric. This one is going to go right side down. So right sides together. This one's right side up. This one's going to go right side down. Center it along that trimming and placement line. I'm going to add a piece of tape just in case, and it's going to stitch a seam right there. And then I'll pull this towards me and get that one. I have my fabric in place and taped. We're going to stitch the seam. Those all stitched out great. No worries there. Everything was lined up just fine. You want to flip the fabric. You can take it to your iron and press it if you want. I'm just going to finger press for now. Before we do the final quilting at the end, I will take it to my iron and give it a good press. But for now, I'm just going to finger press rather than having to continually take my hoop on and off the machine and walk over to my ironing board. Once you have those flipped and pressed, we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. We're going to do this throughout the whole thing. It's going to stitch a trimming and placement line. You'll trim anything extra. You'll place the next piece, stitch the seam, and flip. It's pretty repetitive. Here we go. I have a little bit of fabric I can trim off right here and then down for a little bit on the other one below. What's interesting is you can see this didn't even get caught. I did not slide that piece of fabric down far enough, but my machine has already moved to the next step, which will be stitching the seam. If I hand crank my needle, you see that? There's a 1/4 inch or so, probably seam allowance between the trimming and placement and the seam. So I'm okay, even though that didn't get caught with that trimming and placement line stitch. I'm going to trim the extra fabric. I've got that trimmed on both my blocks. You want to grab your piece 3 fabric, right side down, center it along that trimming and placement line, which I have to move this for because I didn't catch it. I need to see where it ends. It'll be fine though. Center it there. And then I'm going to tape that. I really want to make sure that this doesn't move. I want to make sure that I catch that white fabric underneath since I didn't place that correctly at the beginning. I'm going to do the same thing for this piece for the other block, and then we'll stitch the seam. The seam is stitched. I'm going to remove my tape and then flip and press. It caught the white. Everything's good. Woo! Good thing, because I don't want to have to pick that apart and start over. Go ahead and press that. And then press the one underneath, and we're going to stitch another trimming and placement line. Here's something I noticed. Do you see where the needle is and where the presser foot is? And do you see where the fabric is? I'm going to tape this. I don't want to take a chance that this is going to flip up and get caught underneath. Let's stitch that trimming and placement line. That's stitched out. I'll need to take off my tape. You want to trim this piece of fabric away. Once you've got that trimmed, grab your piece 4. It's the sparkly fabric. Right side down. Center it along that trimming and placement line. Same process we've been doing. I'm going to add a piece of tape just to be careful. And I'll tape my other one. And then we're going to stitch the seam. You'll take your tape off if you taped it, flip it, give it a good press, and then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. Something again that I've noticed, right here I have no fabric. I see batting. Now I know we're going to trim this away and place the next fabric, and I have a 1/4 inch, so that should get covered up. Down here on this block, I don't have that problem, so I'm not sure what I'm doing with my fabric placement, but if that happens and you see a little bit of batting, don't panic because there's a seam allowance. Trim this part away. Next we want piece 5 fabric, right side down, centered along the trimming and placement line. Just like that. You can add a piece of tape if you want to hold it, and I will do that for the other one, and then we'll stitch the seam. Let's look at this one at the top. Remember how I told you there was a little square of batting? There was no fabric. It got caught under that seam allowance. It's just fine. So we'll go ahead and press that. And then since I'm finger pressing these, I'm going to make sure this is nice and flat. And I'm going to add a little piece of tape there just to hold it. Next we're going to stitch our trimming and placement line. You want to take off your tape if you added tape like I did, and then you want to trim off this piece right here. I've got that trimmed. One thing I'm noticing is you do see this gray underneath the white. I did not put fusible behind the white. If that's going to bother you, you're going to want to put fusible fabric behind all the little white pieces. You need fabric 6. This is the light gray fabric if you're using the fabric in the kit. Right side down, centered along the trimming and placement line. Add a piece of tape and stitch the seam. I want to take my tape off, flip it, and press it. Those are both taped into place. I'm going to stitch out the next trimming and placement line. You want to trim any of this extra fabric. Grab your piece 7 fabric, right side down, center it along the trimming and placement line. I'll add a piece of tape and then we'll stitch the seam. Just like before, take the tape off, flip it, and press it, and then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. Same process as before. If you've taped it, remove the tape, trim off the extra fabric. Piece 8 is next. Remember, sparkle side down, center along that stitch line, tape it, and then we're going to stitch the seam. I've got these flip, press, tape. We're going to stitch out the next trimming and placement line. If you tape this, take off the tape, trim off the extra fabric. Next up is piece 9, right side down, so sparkle side down, center it along that line, add your tape, and then we'll stitch the seam. You want to take off your tape, flip, press, and then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. If you use tape, remove the tape, and we're going to trim this part away. We're on piece 10. That's the gray with sprinkles, right side down, centered along the line, tape it, and stitch the seam. You want to take the tape off, flip it, press it, and then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. I have some tape on this piece, so I need to remove that piece of tape, and then I want to trim this. This is another one that came out really tight for me. I actually have nothing to trim. It did catch the fabric here. If you've got extra gray fabric, you want to trim that. We're up to piece 11, right side down, so sprinkle side down, center along that line. I'm going to add a piece of tape, and then we'll stitch the seam. Take the tape off, flip it, press it, and then we're going to stitch another trimming and placement line. You want to take off any tape. You'll notice I put some in the corner and I stopped the second block and did the same thing because it started just outside of my fabric. Once you've got your tape off, we're going to trim away this piece right here. We're on piece 12 and there's 13 pieces, so we're just about done. Same process, centering it, taping, stitching the seam, and then we'll flip it. We need to flip and press these. This one on the bottom, no problem. There's plenty of space down here. But if you've got 2 in the hoop like I do, when you go to flip this one, you can see some of it overlaps into the lower block. So what you need to do is look at this outside stitch line on your piecing template, and you're going to need to trim away anything extra. You just want to make sure that you don't end up getting any of this fabric caught on this block. So I'm going to press this one, trim away the extra, and then tape it. And then this bottom one can just be flipped and pressed. I've got these flipped and pressed, this little bit extra trimmed, and I've added some tape here. Our last trimming and placement line for me is starting off the fabric again. It's going to go up that direction. Remove any tape, trim this piece away, and then our last piece of fabric, piece 13, is going to go right side down, and we'll do the same thing, add a piece of tape, stitch the seam. I've got the last piece taped in place. I had to cut off a little bit of this piece of fabric because it ended up layering onto this block. Let's stitch the last seam. I'm going to take off all my tape. The reason I'm going to remove any and all tape is because I'm going to flip these, and now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and I'm going to give the entire block a good press. I gave both blocks a good press. I had a little overlap of fabric here I had to trim off. We're going to stitch the trimming line. It's going to go around the entire block, and then we're going to stitch out the quilting. when it goes across this way, the fabric is folded the other direction, and I didn't want this to catch, so I just slowed it down as it went over each of the folds, just in case. If you haven't changed your bobbin, now's a good time because we're going to do the quilting and your bobbin's probably almost empty at this point. Let's do our background quilting. We're done with these 2 blocks. You need 4 for this project. Go ahead and make 2 more blocks. We'll trim everything together at the end. We're going to move on to the borders. It tells you to cut 2 pieces, 1.5 by 24.5 inches long. I did this a little bit different and I'll show you why. I cut 4 pieces, 2.5 inches wide by 16 inches long. You'll see there's a note here at the bottom that tells you to cut the border strip 1 to 2 inches longer if quilting them in the hoop. I'm going to be using the 14-inch file, so pretend that number 24 says 14 and this says to cut 1 to 2 inches longer. That's where the 16 inches comes from. Changing the width from 1.5 to 2.5 has to do with how the file is laid out in the machine and the fabric tack down lines. We're going to look at that in just a moment. If you elect to cut 2 of the long borders, you can do 2-in-1 hooping, and then you'll do the thing where you fold the border over and join it and keep going. I'm just going to make 4 separate strips and join them into 2 large strips. I'll put a link in the description box below showing the normal way to do borders, where you cut the long strip and you stitch part of it and you flip it over and you sort of butt them up against each other and join it in the hoop. But I want to get these all done in one hooping, and since this project is going to roll, I'm not going to mind having a seam in my borders. Let's look at the border files and I'll explain the change in width. We'll be working with the 1-inch border files today, and I'm going to use the 14-inch in length. Let's go ahead and bring up our borders. I put everything in the same folder. We're using a 1-inch border for this, and I'm going to use the 14-inch length. I'm going to bring that up 1 by 14. 14 inches long, 1.5 inches wide. That means that the outer stitching lines here are 1.5 inches wide. So if you've cut your fabric strip 1.5 inches wide, when we get to the part where we do the fabric tack down, your fabric is going to lay right on the edge, and it's fine, it works, you can tape it, but it's a little bit fussy. I'm going to want to make 4 of these, and I'm going to make them all at once. Let's hit set, grab our border, slide it over, hit edit, border duplicate, and this time we're not duplicating up and down, we're duplicating left to right. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to spread them out. It's easier to work with them if they're spread out. That's all ready to go. I'm going to hit OK, save it to my machine, and then we're going to hit embroidery and we'll get started. The first thing that's going to stitch out are the batting placement lines, and it'll stitch out 1, 2, 3, 4. I cut my batting at 2.5 inches wide, just like the fabric. I know that's going to be wide enough. You could probably get away with 2 inches wide. Let's go ahead and stitch out the batting placement lines. I have the color Mercury on my machine still. I'm going to leave that on throughout this. All 4 batting placement lines have stitched. Let's go ahead and measure that. That way, if you're just watching and you're going to do your project later, you'll know how big you have to cut your batting. So it's 1 inch, which makes sense because this is a 1-inch finished border. So I would cut your batting at least 1.5 inches. That's going to give you a 1/4 inch over on each side. Mine are 2.5 inches. It'll be really easy for me to place these. I won't really have to tape them or worry about that. Let me get all 4 placed. I have my batting covering the batting placement lines. The next thing we're going to do is stitch the tack down. Everything's tacked down. You want to trim everything that's outside of the tack down line. Once you've got your batting trimmed, we're going to stitch the fabric placement lines. Now that the fabric placement lines have stitched, I can show you again with the ruler why I cut my fabric extra wide. Here's the outer line right there, the outer fabric placement line. Here's the other fabric placement line. They're exactly 1.5 inches apart. So when you cut your fabric strip 1.5 inches, when you get to this step, you've got to lay it down really, really carefully. And the next thing that happens is it stitches a fabric tack down line. Let's look and see where the needle is. Okay, this time it looks like it's right inside the fabric placement line, which is good. I cut 2.5 inch strips, much easier. I don't have to worry about having enough fabric widthwise. It's going to fit very easily. I'm going to lay out the fabric for all 4. We'll stitch out the fabric tack down, and then I'll measure the fabric tack down from the front, and we'll see how wide that is. Everything is tacked down. Let's measure it. So 1 stitch line here, 1 here. It's 1 1/4. So if you cut your strips at 1 1/2, here's 1 1/2. That would be really tight. You'd have approximately 1/8 of an inch on either side. But as it stitches these, it tacks this down, and you're going over batting, and they kind of round because they go over the batting. So if you haven't cut your strips yet, 2 1/2, you can see I've got plenty of room. I think 1 1/2 is too tight. If you go 2 inches instead of 2 1/2, you'll have plenty. So if you haven't cut your strips yet and you're only going to make this project and you're using the kit in the box, you do have plenty of fabric to cut these at 2 inches instead of 1 1/2. I'm going to check my bobbin because the next thing we're going to do is the quilting. These are all quilted. I'm going to take this over to the table. We're going to trim our blocks and trim our borders and then put this project together. The first thing we're going to do is trim our blocks. If you like to save your extra stabilizer, which I do, I reuse it, cut off any big pieces, set them aside, and separate all your blocks. These blocks are going to be 6 inches finished, so we trim them to 6.5 inches. If you happen to have the Kimberbell orange pop rulers, one of the square ones is 6.5 inches, so we can use that today. If you've never used these before, what you do is you frame the block. We're lining up that stitch line, and then I'm grabbing the next size up. This will give your hand somewhere to sit. The advantage to using the orange pop rulers on a project like this is because this is puffy. Since we have all of these flip and fold fabrics and there's batting, when you put a regular ruler on top of it, it kind of goes back and forth. I like to grab something to use kind of like a paperweight right there. We're going to start cutting on this side. If you're right-handed, you're cutting on this side. If you're left-handed, you'll cut on the other side. Got my rotary cutter. You're going to put it in this little notch right down here at the bottom and slide it as far over to the left as possible. Go ahead and cut. Rotating cutting mats really help. Not necessary, but very convenient. You can find one on sale. The holidays are a great time to look for things like rotating cutting mats, notions, things that you're finding that you'd like to have in your sewing room, because a lot of times that's when those things go on sale. Now I moved that ruler. Did you see that? Even though I have my little paperweight, it slid. So I need to readjust. Lining back up along those 2 stitch lines I have left to cut. Hold that down. Watch your finger. Had my finger like that. That's bad news because you go all the way up to the top. Oh, there goes the lid. I've got one more to cut, and then I'll do the rest of these off camera. We'll just work through this one together. I've got that folded kind of weird. I'm going to go ahead and pull these off. This was kind of stuck underneath. And there's that little bit that I missed. There you go. I'm going to cut the other 3 blocks. I've got all 4 of my palm blocks cut. I'm going to set these to the side. Let's get our border strips. Same thing on these. If you've got a big piece of stabilizer you want to cut off on the top and the bottom to save, do that, and then separate your borders. These are 1 inch finished borders. From this stitching line here to this stitching line here is 1 1/4, and we'll be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you do not want to cut on these 2 lines. There's 2 ways you can cut it because you want 1 1/2 inches wide. You can add 1/8 of an inch. I have 1/8 of an inch ruler. You would line up 1/8 of an inch and then cut. You can do that from the front, or turn it over to the back. This line here, the outside stitching line, and then this outside line here are 1 1/2 inches wide. That's the easiest way, I think, to cut these. So I'm going to cut these on the outside line. If you're having trouble seeing it, you can always grab a washable marker or like a friction pen or something. Mark it. I just mark the top and the bottom. That'll help me line this up. Cutting right on those threads. Now when I turn it around, I can measure 1.5 inches from the cut line that I just did. 1.5. And that was cutting right on that other stitch line. Now I can tell I cut that a little bit crooked. It's not going to matter, but I'll show you. See how there's more fabric on this side than on this side? So I didn't do the best job cutting, but that's okay. I'm going to cut right here on the edge because I have to join them together. I'm going to cut the rest of my border strips, make my borders longer. I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch my borders together. I'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, let's look at these. Not quite lined up. This doesn't line up with this. That's because I trimmed these individually. When you do this in the hoop, when you join one to the next, you can watch those lines and make sure everything lines up. Nobody's ever going to notice. What we need to do is sew our blocks together. If you want it to look just like the picture, they go the same direction. So you're going to sew one block to the next, 1/4 inch seam allowance, all 4. If you want to make it look a bit different, you can always change the orientation. And this is kind of fun. Before you sew them all together in a row, you can play with them and see what it would look like if you were doing a different type of project. That looks really cool. I like that. That would make a really nice pillow, wouldn't it? And turn them and see what they look like when you change the direction. Completely different look with the same block. That's amazing. How fun is that? So you can play with them for a little bit before you put everything together. I'm going to go ahead and make mine like the picture, so I'll sew them all together the same way. 1/4 inch seam, and then I'll press them open. I'll bring it back and show you what that looks like. Here's all 4 blocks. I actually didn't press open. When you sew them together, they naturally go in one direction. So I just went ahead and pressed them the direction they were going rather than fight with it. The next thing we're going to do is attach our borders. Now I know my borders are long enough. Remember, I made 28 inches worth of border, so I have a little extra on top, a little extra on the bottom. Since I have a seam, I'm going to go ahead and match this seam in the middle, and I'm going to use clips because there's a bit of bulk with this. We've got quilted pieces that we're working with. You're going to attach your borders with a 1/4 inch seam to the top and the bottom. I'll go ahead and do that off camera. I'll figure out which way it wants to be pressed and I'll bring that back and I'll show it to you. I have the borders sewn on. Everything pressed to the center very easily, so I went ahead and let that press to the center. Mine are a little long. I need to trim off the extra. Got that trimmed. I'm going to set this aside. We need to grab our pocket fabric. It says to fold it in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and press well. Like that. Fold that in half, take it over to your ironing board and give it a good press. Here's my pocket fabric, wrong sides together, pressed well. We're going to grab our lining fabric. That's this piece, another long piece of fabric. Place it right side up. We're going to grab our pocket fabric, align the raw edges, so this part, not the fold, the raw edges with the bottom of the lining fabric. Like that. They're the same length. All your raw edges are down here. The fabric fold is right here. You want to grab some pins. It says to pin it in place. I've got that pinned all the way around. The fabric fold is right here. Grab your quilted piece, line them up so they're the same on the edge there, like that. I'm going to get something to hold that in place. I'm going to grab one of my clappers. I just want to hold that so it doesn't slide. We're going to draw lines on the lining and pocket fabric aligned with the piece blocks on the front. Where you have a seam, and here we're going to draw a line on the fabric. I'm going to get some tape. You absolutely, positively can use a water-soluble pen for this if you like. I don't like to have to get my project wet, so I'm going to use a piece of tape. We're going to be drawing that line to match up with the seam. I'm going to put a piece of tape right there, and then I need 2 more pieces. Got my tape. I'm going to grab a ruler and I'm going to line up the ruler with the seam, and then I'm going to go ahead and draw that line, drawing it on my tape. So I don't have to worry about getting the marker on my fabric and getting my fabric wet. This marker does come off. I've used it before. I've drawn all over white fabric and it's fine. I just don't want to get this wet right now, especially when I'm filming. I don't want to have to wait for anything to dry. So you're sort of matching up and drawing a line where the seam is on your block onto your lining and pocket fabric. I'm going to guess this is one of those things that doesn't need to be perfect. Get it as close to the right spot as possible. Okay, 1, 2, 3 lines. We can go ahead and get this out of the way for now. So let me pull that off camera. We're going to draw some additional lines for pockets. We've got 4 pockets. A side pocket, 2 center pockets, and another side pocket. The instructions tell us we're going to draw additional lines to further divide up these pockets. They divided the center pockets in half, so right here. And if you remember, our blocks are 6 inches, so this is about 6 inches apart. So they draw another line, giving you a 3-inch pocket, a 3-inch pocket, a 3-inch pocket, and a 3-inch pocket. And then the outer pockets, they divide it into thirds. So they draw 2 lines approximately 2 inches apart. This is the part of this project where you can customize it. Let's say you're using this for maybe paintbrushes, knitting needles, crochet needles, certain kinds of art supplies, sewing supplies. Maybe you want to use this for traveling and you have a lot of cords. You can make these pockets any size you want. Maybe you want a pocket for your rotary cutter. So I'd lay it down. Okay, I need that much space for my rotary cutter. I always travel with, let's say, a screwdriver. So I want a smaller pocket for the screwdriver. Maybe you like to travel with a water-soluble pen. I've got a fabric marker, a pencil, and a regular pen. I can make smaller pockets inside of this. You can get all your scissors and figure out how much space you need for scissors. Easy to customize this. I'm going to go ahead and make this exactly as it's listed in the instructions, so you can follow along with that if you like, but just know there's other ways to divide up these pockets. I'm going to start with the 2 center pockets. So for the center pockets, they divided it in half. I'm going to eyeball it. Put my tape down the middle. It's a little long. Go ahead and cut that. And put my other piece of tape down the middle. There we go. And then I'm going to draw a line. You can measure at this point. It said 3 inches apart. Let's measure. I did pretty good. 3 inches. And then I'll go ahead and make a line. And we'll do the same thing over here. Let's measure 3 inches from that line. 3 inches, 3 inches. And let's connect our little dots. So those are all lined and ready. Let's go down this way. We're going to measure 2 inches and 2 inches. Okay, 2 inches. And then I'll want to add another piece of tape down here. Ow, I just poked the pin. Don't poke your pins. Watch out for your pins. 2 inches. 2 inches. Connect the line there. Everything's marked, but we're not going to sew on everything. It may have been easier to use 2 different colors of pen in hindsight, but that's okay. If you use 1 color of pen, do this. Slide that down again, grab your block, all the blocks. I'm not going to sew on that, and on that. So the lines that we marked that line up with your block seams, we're not sewing. And I know myself, so let's make this really, really clear. There. Now I know which one's not to sew on. Now that we've got these marked, we're going to do a little bit of sewing. It says to sew from the bottom to the top, but when you get to the fold, to back stitch to give it a little bit of extra security, and it does show stitching all the way to the top. The only reason I can think to continue stitching past this fold is just to make it look nice and to help keep it divided like visually, so when you go to place things in, you'll be able to see that. You'll have to decide what color thread you want to use. You've got blue fabric, and dark gray fabric. I have beige thread on my machine. I'm using the beige thread. I'm just going to leave it. So we're going to sew, go back and forth, sew. Don't sew on the ones that you marked with the X's. And I'm going to sew right on top of the tape, and then I'll peel the tape off after. I sewed on the lines that I was supposed to sew on. I had to pull some pins along the way. I'm going to take a moment and remove all of my tape. I've got all the tape off. If I did this again, I wouldn't do that and sew on top of the tape. It was kind of hard to pick out. What I probably would do is put a little piece at the top and a little piece at the bottom and just mark that, or I would use chalk or just draw the marker on it and then spray it off with water. But everything came out. I don't have to restitch anything. I was able to tug the threads here and pull that and flatten it out. I did take out all my pins. I kept poking myself. I'm not sure why we pinned it all the way around like that. I think clipping it in a couple spaces probably would be sufficient. The next thing we want to do is get our little ribbon. It's really wrinkled. I'm going to run it under the iron really quick. Be careful. It's probably polyester. You don't want to melt it. That looks better. It says to fold it in half. Touch the ends, fold it in half. Place the fold on the center of the left edge. Fold left edge. This is to place it on the center. So I'm going to fold this. Press. Now I can see where the center is. And then we've got our folded edge. It's going to go right there. And then it shows pinning up and down. We're going to be sewing around, so I guess they want your pin more than 1/4 of an inch in. And then it does show taping the loose pieces so it doesn't get caught as we sew around. Got some tape. That's not going anywhere. So that's taped down. The instructions are a bit confusing. Make sure you've got the top edge here. Here's the openings for your pockets. This is the top edge of the quilted section. We're going to put them right sides together. Make sure your top edges are lining up. But honestly, if you put it on upside down, nobody's going to know. It says to align all edges and pin in place. I've had enough of pins today. I'm going to use clips. Let's do top center and bottom center. And then I'll clip here. Here's another seam, and there. We'll go to the edge and I'll clip on the border seams. Once you've got it clipped, sew around the perimeter, leaving a 3-inch opening on the right side opposite the ribbon. So our ribbon's over here. Let's keep clipping. This is going to be the inside. I'll mark it. That's 3 inches. And to make sure I don't sew that part, I'm going to mark it with red clips. My red clips are going to be my start and stop points. And then something else that I can do too. I have another big one right here. That way I know I'm not going to sew that part. One more here and one more here. I'm going to take that to my sewing machine, go down and go around, and then stop here. Where I start and stop, I'll go back and forth because we're going to be turning this right side out and I don't want the stitches to pop. Everything is sewn. We're going to turn it right side out. I'm going to go ahead and clip the corners, reduce a little bit of that bulk, and I'll do that before I flip this right side out. Now we're going to flip this right side out. You may want to leave more than 3 inches. I have about 3 1/4 inches. It's a little bulky. Once you've got it right side out, it says to use a point turner to get the corners. Go through, poke your corners out, and then take it to your iron, give it a good press, and we'll be folding this under to close it. I'll show you how to do that. Before you head to the ironing board, remove the tape. You don't ever want to iron over the paper tape. It'll burn. Here's the opening. Now, it tells us just to top stitch around the opening. So you see my pocket's not anchored because none of this is attached. And fold in, and then take it to your machine. I'm going to get some clips and make sure that you catch both the lining, the gray lining, and your pocket. Make sure you've got everything folded in. That looks good. It does match up easy enough, and you've got plenty of fabric. I don't feel like I'm really having to work that hard to get the folds on the inside. Sometimes when you get openings like this and you need to close them, you just don't have enough fabric to do it right. You've got plenty of fabric here to work with. I've got this clipped. I need to go sew this part closed. I need to switch to white thread. I'll do that and I'll come back. I've got that top stitched closed. I'm glad I switched to white thread. There's my top stitching. And I did it from the front and then I flipped it over and I hadn't caught it from the back. I had to go on the back side and run another top stitch, but it looks fine from the front. Definitely use white thread. Your opening on the side is closed. We're going to flip this to the front. I'm going to recommend getting this out of the way because we're going to do a little more stitching. You don't want to run over your ribbon. What it says to do, it's stitch in the ditch. We're going to stitch between each block from the top to the bottom edge to attach the front and lining together and to finish sewing the pockets. So it's telling us to stitch here to here. We don't want to stitch across the borders. That won't look pretty. So you'll start and you'll stitch right in that seam and then go to the top. So you've got 1, 2, 3 seams. I've got all of those little seams stitched as close to, in the ditch as I can. This is done. Let's flip it over and look at the back. And this is kind of funny because I used beige thread and white thread, but it looks the same. Now you can fill your pockets. So whatever you want to use this for, look, a rotary cutter does fit. That's the big pocket. Some scissors, smaller things, tweezers to help pull out the tape because you're a moron and stitched over them, a screwdriver, my point turner. You get the idea. And take the tape off the ribbon. That's how we learn, right? Actually, you can put that like that, and then you just roll it, and you take the ribbon. You can tie it and then you take it with you. So you could make this project with different sized blocks to make it bigger or smaller. Just change your lining. You can change the border sizes, change your ribbon size. That's ready to go. How fun is that? If you don't have a gift for somebody, you could do this and fill it with their favorite things or fill it with candy. I'm hungry. I would love to have this filled with candy. You know those swirly peppermint sticks, but they make them in all different colors? Oh, that would be great. Fill it with candy and give it to somebody. Let me put all this away and we'll take a final look at our project. It does say to fray check or heat seal the ends of these. They're actually sealed. I don't feel the need to do that, but you can do that if you want, especially if you trim it, then I would do that. Here's our design roll using the 6-inch palm leaf block from the December 2025 Perfectly Piece box. Remember, next year it goes to digital only and I'm going to have a fun project for you, and that project will run all year long and we're going to make good use of all of our blocks and borders. Coming up next, I have all my fabric prepped for the Let It Snow pillow and for the Snow Place tiling scene from the Feeling Festive Bella box. Watch for these videos. If you enjoyed making this project with me, please leave any comments or questions below the video. Like, subscribe, and share with your friends. I'll be bringing you Perfectly Pieced, Hoop Studio, and next year I'll be bringing you the new Applique of the Month Club. We'll also be starting on Sweetheart Street January of next year. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.